Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders, 2025 Regional Edward R. Murrow Award winner for Best Podcast. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee.
Gabby, what if I told you one of the hardest places to get to in the United States also has some of the biggest clues as to how dinosaurs got to New Mexico?
Based on what I know about this subject matter, I would believe you because it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we know New Mexico is rich in fossils. We've had that discussion here on the podcast
Rich
before.
in history
Yes,
as well.
Rich, very much so. Cultural history, fossilized history, space history. I could go on. I don't want to, though.
Yeah.
Because I want to talk about what we're here
We've
today
done plenty of episodes about all these subjects, but this one is really exciting.
Yeah, and that fact, what we were just talking about here, really sets the stage for the discussion today with an expert in New Mexico and on New Mexico dinos, essentially. Our modern understanding of Alaska and New Mexico, obviously, is that these two places are pretty far away, pretty different climates. But some of what we're discussing here really ties the two states together tens of millions of years in the past.
Wow, fascinating. Let's just bring in our guest and get into it. He is the paleontologist, Dr. Anthony Fiorillo, who's also the executive director of New Mexico's Museum of Natural History and Science. Dr. Fiorillo, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And wanted to start with a little bit about you. If you can tell us about yourself. We mentioned how you're a paleontologist. How did you get to where you are today? And what would you say is your specialty, so to speak?
It's a long story. Let's turn the dial all the way back.
Okay.
I'm the executive director of the Natural History Museum, so I'm a big fan of natural history museums. And that's in part because my parents credit my grandmother with taking the 4-year-old version of me on a city bus across town to go to a natural history museum where I grew up. And they say I never outgrew that visit. Wow. So I'm a huge fan of what our Natural History Museum means to our community. So somewhere along the line, I lost track of that slightly because I started, as kids grow up, you discover things like baseball and other things. But once it came to college, I decided to give this thing a try and see where it would go. And so it kept my interest, and I am a trained paleontologist. I was always interested in dinosaurs. I am that kid that never grew up. And here we are.
Love that. What was the first museum?
That museum was the Peabody Museum at Yale University. I grew up in the New Haven area. And so I went there every chance I could. And arguably the happiest day of my life was when I turned 16, got my driver's license, and could drive myself to the museum instead of bugging some relative to take me.
Right. And what is your specialty today? We talked a little bit about that. What do you do today? Because obviously you mentioned director of the Natural History Museum here, executive director here, but you do other work too.
As a paleontologist, I've studied dinosaurs. I studied that last window that dinosaurs were around, which is called the Cretaceous period. And as of last month, I completed my 28th field season in Alaska. So if I had to say what is my reputation or the biggest accolade of my reputation, it's that I study high-latitude dinosaurs. And the reason for that is Alaska is a land bridge between Asia and North America, and most of the dinosaurs that we have here in New Mexico, their origins can be traced to Central Asia.
Wow, high latitude. Interesting. So yeah, we'll take this in layers, but you've led the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science in Albuquerque. It's a source of some podcast episodes we've done in the past. As we record this, the museum is undergoing a big renovation. The doors are closed, but there's plans to reopen in the spring of 2026, right?
Correct.
Is that on track?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. What's the significance of the museum here in New Mexico? Why is it considered maybe a hot spot for dinosaur history?
Well, some of the first fossils found in the state back in the 19th century were dinosaur remains. So we as a state have a strong history of the discovery of fossil animals, the history of life on Earth. And some of those first finds are actually in New York at the American Museum of Natural History, which is arguably the world's greatest natural history museum. So we have had this connection. As a matter of fact, the American Museum, when they decided to become very proactive and do field excavations, the rumor of what's here was so intriguing that the American Museum sent their first field expedition to New Mexico to basically see how much is here. So we have had a very solid reputation, the state, of having an incredible geologic history. Then next year will be our 40th anniversary. And so when we reopen, we'll be celebrating not only the new building renovations, but also this 40th anniversary. Somewhere in the late 70s and early 1980s, there was a geologic field trip from the University of New Mexico geology department. And as the legend goes, you know, the faculty, the graduate students, they're sitting around a campfire talking about things. And they say, gee, wouldn't it be great if New Mexico had a place to house all these fossils instead of them always going somewhere else? And you had that scientific basis combined with people like Mary Gavin, who knew the legislature. So the chemistry was right to create this vision and this new museum, which opened in 1986. And so, like I said, when we reopen, we're celebrating our 40th year.
Very cool. Well, we wanted to talk to you, of course, about some of the research that you brought up here, the stuff that you've spearheaded in a recent trip that you just returned from. You were just in Alaska, as I understand, continuing research into the Cretaceous era and those dinosaurs in that window, including a lot of the dinosaurs that are found in New Mexico. Essentially, that research out in Alaska ties to New Mexico. So, as Gabby mentioned, we'll kind of take this in layers, but if you can tell us broadly about the dinosaurs that we have found in New Mexico, what are they? What are they like? What in this Cretaceous era? How do you sort of explain what they are like in that window?
We have quite a few dinosaurs here. And, you know, the story starts somewhat in the northwestern part of the state in what's called the San Juan Basin. The dinosaurs we have there include things like duck-billed dinosaurs, which are very common. Sometimes they're referred to as the cows of the Cretaceous. They're so common. The horned dinosaurs, the predatory dinosaurs, big and small ones. We have tyrannosaur-sized dinosaurs from up there. Then all of those dinosaurs came from Asia, and they evolved and became their own selves, if you will, down here. Then we have one dinosaur that came from the south, from a land bridge connecting the southern continents, and that would be the Alamosaurus, which is, in some people's minds, the iconic dinosaur, the four-legged, long-necked, long-tailed, really big dinosaurs that roamed around. That's actually New Mexico's contribution to the dinosaur world. Back around 1922, the first one was found in northwestern New Mexico, Alamosaurus. So we have quite a collection that's really unique to New Mexico.
The link that we have to Alaska, which is interesting, just saying that phrase, most of the dinosaurs in New Mexico are also found in this region of southern Alaska, the Aniakchak National Monument and Preserve, correct? How is that possible, and how do you know that there's a relationship there?
Yeah, you mentioned that land bridge.
Yeah, there's that's a great question, and we could spend the rest of today talking about just that one issue, but we won't.
I'm excited. I'm ready.
People think of the Bering Land Bridge in the context of woolly mammoths, early peopling of North America, etc. But the geologic plates that create that land bridge were actually in place somewhere around 100 to 120 million years ago. So that land bridge has got a lot of antiquity to it. If you could somehow magically have a satellite image of that part of the world, let's say 70 million years ago, it would look vaguely familiar because the northern and southern boundaries of Alaska are kind of in place by that time. And so, like plants and animals do today, they expand and contract their ranges. And so these dinosaurs, based on the fossil record in places like Mongolia, the Gobi Desert in northern China, the origins, the most primitive forms of these dinosaurs can be found there. And then you see this progression of dinosaurs through Alaska, down western North America, and coming into New Mexico, where they, by that time, have evolved into different species than what we saw back in Asia, if that makes sense.
Did they walk?
Yes.
Like from what we now know as Alaska to New Mexico?
Yes, they would have walked, and obviously we're talking about generations upon generations of movement, that it wasn't something that happened. Somebody said in Mongolia one day, hey, I feel like going to North America, so I'm going to start walking. It's something where the ranges expanded gradually, and what we're doing in Alaska is trying to understand the environmental conditions of those dinosaurs, so we understand what those filters were that allowed animals to come all the way to New Mexico, and then sometimes it would shut off, and that movement would stop. And so that's one of the things that makes us go to Alaska.
And does the Alamosaurus factor in here in this research, right, as well? We were talking about that animal a little earlier.
Oh, in a sense, it does. In that we know Alamosaurus didn't come from Asia. It came from the southern latitudes. And really, you don't, from the southern continents, let me say. And they don't get that far north. They get through New Mexico. They're in West Texas. We excavated a beautiful specimen from Big Bend National Park some 20 years ago. But they don't get much farther north than southern Utah. And so what stopped them? And that's one of those questions that, you understand these environments, and it's like what the adaptations of these animals were to environments.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
KRQE News 13 investigations. One of the biggest cons in New Mexico history. How did they get away with it?
Well, they had an accomplice. The state of New Mexico.
A road rage encounter leads to murder.
I miss him every single day.
Did the judicial system fail here?
New Mexico's families, homes, and lives are left in ashes.
There's a level of anxiety.
FEMA has been an abject and abysmal failure.
Watch anytime on krqe.com or our YouTube channel.
If you can tell us how challenging it is where you did this area, this research in this area, how challenging is it to get into that area and to sort of set up shop? It is an area you have seen before, obviously, but is it truly kind of like, you could say, the Alaskan bush, so to speak? I mean, what is this area like where you're doing the fossil work that you've been doing?
Where I was last month, Aniakchak, is they make a claim that they are perhaps the least visited national park unit in the country. And if you go to their website, they have fun with that. They have a gorgeous panoramic view, and the headline says, "No lines, no waiting." And really, that's true. Now, one of the reasons why is you can't drive there from here. And to get there, we have to fly in by float plane. It is the Alaskan Peninsula, or Alaska Peninsula, and the weather there is notoriously bad. We followed in the footsteps of a Jesuit priest from the 1930s who was also a trained geologist, Father Bernard Hubbard. And in his book, he calls this area the cradle of storms. And that is absolutely appropriately named, because we have waited 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days for the weather to be clear for us to be able to fly. And so it's a place that teaches you patience, that you can't do what you want to do exactly when you want to do it. And so there are a lot of challenges. You come in by float plane, you offload, so you're wading through the water with all of your gear and food and so on. You set up, and then we stay in a cabin, which may sound posh, but to be clear, it's 4 walls, a floor, and a roof. The plumbing is the creek that runs nearby, where you get the water and then you filter it, and that's what we cook and clean with. So it's about as rustic as it can get.
Yeah, it sounds like a place that kind of takes you back and makes you maybe reflect on like what it was like years ago before we had all these amenities that we live with today.
It is one of the beauties of being out there is it does make you reflect back on or think about what really is important. And your priorities are, will the stove work so I can have a hot dinner? What are the bears going to do today? Things like that. So it gets very, it peels back layers and you understand what's really important.
Yeah, what humans used to do before all of this. One of the interesting things, again, about making these discoveries is the research that also goes into identifying what you're actually looking for. Fossils, for example, they can be hidden behind layers of dirt and other rock, right? Sometimes they may not have a distinct form to the average eye. How do you know when you're looking at something like a dinosaur footprint or the footprint of something that speaks to your research?
That's a great question. And, my own operating style is that this was all brand new. When I started this project, it's getting to be a few years ago now. The idea at the time, I was living in the Dallas area, and you could understand when I had the idea to go and look, but it was the kind of place where, here's this guy from Dallas. He wants to come to Alaska during the summertime to find something no one's ever found before. It sounds like a boondoggle. So I hit a lot of roadblocks before this thing took off. And that put a certain pressure on. The first discovery had to be perfect or as close to it as possible. And that first one, I'm going to do a little sidetrack here. Okay. The first place I wanted to look was Denali National Park, which is the most popular national park in Alaska. And you can imagine they're very bureaucratic there. And here's a guy from Dallas, and it's like, yeah, I don't think so. We're not going to support this. So then I was too stubborn to give up on the idea. So I went someplace where I looked at a map and thought, well, where is someplace where they just might be happy to see another human being? And that was Aniakchak. The headquarters is in a town called King Salmon, which is only about 400 people. And so they welcomed me. We got a project rolling. The first trip was to fly into a caldera, which is the whole reason why that park is there. It's a collapsed magma chamber. People here know what calderas are. Right. And we did this whitewater raft trip. And literally in the last 2 hours of this project, I found a footprint that I thought can convince people because it had 3 toes. It had the shape, et cetera, et cetera. From that, that got people excited, and we worked in Aniakchak for a little while. And then in the category of sibling rivalry, because Aniakchak was off and nobody had even heard of it, Denali, literally the people who were telling me, no, that's a dumb idea, they called me up and said, well, we can't let that little park get all those dinosaur headlines. Why don't you come and look over in our park? And sure enough, Denali for 14 years produced thousands of discoveries. Sure. But you asked about how things are covered. This year in particular, the winter storms dumped seaweed like nobody's business on the rocks that we would normally want to look at. 100 yards, 3 feet deep. And it really, we tried not to think about what we were missing underneath all that seaweed and just focus on what we could see. And that's how the project goes, is you take what you can and not worry about what you can't do.
So what were some of the latest things that you found at this trip?
Well, we found more footprints. The dominant tracks that we find are those of duck-billed dinosaurs, and some of them are adults down to little babies. And that's pretty cool because it tells us that these dinosaurs were living and thriving in the area. We also found an ankylosaur footprint, a couple of them actually, and those are those armored dinosaurs. They walk around on 4 legs. Sometimes they have tail clubs. They're like tanks on legs. And we had found those before, but some of the things we were interested in were things like, and this doesn't sound very exciting, but we found freshwater clam burrows. Ooh, why are we excited about those? Well, freshwater clams are things called unionids, and what they are, they're sort of water quality indicators. We know that these dinosaurs were walking around in areas that were rivers and streams, but the clams tell us that the pH of the water was neutral or possibly alkaline, slightly alkaline, as opposed to acidic, because otherwise the shells would dissolve. They also tell us, because they're filter feeders, that the water was running clear as opposed to murky. So there's little details like that. We found forest horizons where we were measuring the spacing of trees, which basically, could a duck-billed dinosaur walk through this forest or not? And so we found places where the trees were densely packed and places where they were more spread out. So, and there were footprints where we were seeing these things. So it helped us focus the reconstruction.
Wow. And you mentioned who's with you on this trek?
Well, my team is always small, and part of that's driven largely by, it's very expensive to get to these places, as you might imagine, is how many seats are on a plane. And we're flying little Cessnas, de Havilland Beaver, sometimes it's a Super Cub, and so they're little planes, and so I have to be very selective about who can go and what are their toolkits to contribute to the story. There are two guys in particular I've worked with for going on 20 years. One of them he was the former chair of the geology department at the University of Alaska, Dr. Paul McCarthy. He studies, as we like to say, I study the dinosaurs. He studies the mud between the toes of the dinosaurs. He studies fossil soils, and soils tell us a lot about the environment. The other person that I've worked with for a while is Dr. Yoshi Kobayashi from Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan. How did that come about? Well, Yoshi is a former student of mine when I was in Dallas, and it was just something where the chemistry was right, and we became fast friends, and we do a lot of work together in Mongolia, Japan, and Alaska. And so, as you might imagine, the conditions are challenging. You like to have people you can count on. And these guys, we know each other's breathing. And then the fourth member of our team was a former National Geographic photo editor, Kim Hubbard, and she photo documented our trip.
Wow. So you had all those guys with you on this trip?
There were the four of us, and then there was one person from the park who, her name was Sarah Moy, and she was just somebody we've worked with the last 2 years.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hey guys, Chad Brummett here with New Mexico Frontiers, the KRQE original series that focuses on tech and innovation happening right here in New Mexico. We've got a lot of great stories about various businesses, technology, and of course space exploration. So make sure that you follow us on air at KRQE and Fox New Mexico, as well as our KRQE YouTube channel online. In the meantime, let's get back to the New Mexico News Insiders.
Well, this is just fresh on my mind having this conversation. I was recently listening to Steve Rinella talking on a podcast. If you're not familiar, he's an avid outdoorsman, founder of Meat Eater. Anyway, he was talking about how his brother works in Alaska and this idea that people there are still trying to document and write down what is actually there, how this is like a unique place in nature where there still exists this feeling of it being untouched compared to other parts of the U.S., where even if you go out in nature, you can tell there's been a lot of human activity. Do you get that sense when you go to Alaska? And does it speak to the idea of why there are still new things to discover there year over year for researchers like yourself?
I would agree with most of that. Alaska is 20% of the geography of the United States. Most people don't understand that. And whether I'm the first person or not, there are thousands of years of human habitation up there that it's hard to say. But it is safe for me to say that I would go so far as to say 99% of the time, when the helicopter lands and I step out and then a helicopter takes off, I am the first person with my training to set foot on those rocks and take a look. And there's the example I'll give you is, for example, the Denali National Park, where I did about 14 years of work. When I got invited to actually go look for dinosaurs, Denali is a place where there's been a lot of geologic investigation, but none of them were trained the way I was. And so they said, well, based on their observations about the rocks, you might have better luck here, or your probability of success was there. A couple of years later, after we had found certainly hundreds of dinosaur tracks, and I saw them again at a conference, they were laughing and sort of smacking their forehead. It's like, how did we miss them? And it's because they're not trained to see the things that I see.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And, you know, when we think about Alaska versus New Mexico, the climates, as we mentioned, are not very similar. Were they back when these dinosaurs were alive? Were they at all similar? And, you know, why would the evolution of these dinosaurs over the generations, like you said, make their way to what we now know is New Mexico?
Well, starting in Alaska, we can say for sure the window I spend most of my time in is about 70 million years. And about 70 million years ago in Alaska, the temperatures were much, much warmer. There was variation in rainfall across the state based on where I was. But the temperatures range to a mean annual temperature similar to things like Calgary to, say, Portland, Oregon. And that's certainly capable of being cold, but not the Arctic. And so that's true. Coming down to New Mexico, there are places about the same age where we find fossil palm wood, for example. And palm tells us that the temperatures here were even warmer, no big surprise because we're lower latitude, but we never experienced long windows of freezing. And so there is a very definite band of temperatures the dinosaurs loved that was driven in part that there was no prolonged freezing.
When you look back at your research now across all these years, what is the understanding that you have now in 2025, or a better understanding of than you did when you first started? And why is this still worth pursuing for you?
Wow, there's a couple things that went through my head as you were asking that question. One is I do look back, and I look back because, as I said, this was my 28th year. And after a while, you start to really scratch your head and go, how did this all happen?
Yeah.
And I consider myself incredibly lucky, incredibly fortunate, however you want to phrase it. I just can't believe that when I see the kids come into the museum and ooh and ah over our dinosaurs, I actually do look at some of them and wonder, where will they be 10, 20, 30 years from now? Like, will they be able to pursue those curiosities the way I was? To go back to, I think your question was a little bit more directed at the results. When I first went there, again, 28 years ago, the number of dinosaur localities in Alaska, you could probably count on one hand. And now, based on the work and opportunities that we have been able to take advantage of, it seems like you can't take 10 steps without tripping over a dinosaur record of some kind. And so that's kind of long-winded. So I would say, one, we have learned that dinosaurs didn't just pass through the area on their way to New Mexico. They lived and thrived in a place that is counter to the stereotype of what dinosaurs are supposed to be in. And so I think we've successfully challenged that stereotype. And then the biodiversity, it's just mind-blowing how much is up there and how it tells us that dinosaurs were incredibly well adapted to wherever it was they lived.
Yeah, it's really, it's got to feel good to know that you have challenged those assumptions with, the facts from your research over all these years.
And it also takes a lot of pleasure in knowing that there are other teams now that are exploring some of these places and asking questions and testing our models and so on. So it is very satisfying.
Do you ever feel that you strike me as somebody who is constantly curious, but do you ever feel like your research pursuits are satiated, or will there always be something to discover in your lifetime, you think?
I have told my team that if reincarnation works, I hope we all come back and get to do this again. So no, we're not satisfied.
Yeah. For sure. Okay, so what happens next in your research? Where does this lead you? What do you even do with these recent discoveries? Are you hauling any fossils back to New Mexico or something else?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. Next month, there's the annual Geological Society of America conference, and I will be presenting a paper on our behalf on what we think we know in Aniakchak National Monument. We do have a related New Mexico discovery that, stay tuned. We're not ready yet. And so at the end of a field season, after you've cleaned your gear, stored it, and so on, you start to analyze what you think you know. And so that's the window I'm in, starting to think about presenting papers. And in this case, when I come back from the meeting in San Antonio, based on the feedback we get from the presentation, we'll be able to decide how to write the paper. And so the winters, when you start doing that, you start going into the permitting window, which is the spring, and hopefully you get back in the field in the summer.
Yeah. So I take it you're headed back maybe next summer?
It all depends on the funding.
Yeah. Okay.
Where does the funding come from?
It comes from a variety of sources. I've had it from National Science Foundation, from National Geographic, from a group in New York called the Explorers Club, some corporate donations, so on and so on. It's a whole chessboard.
Wow.
Is there anything else you want people to know about your work?
As far as the nature of our work, I find it incredibly fascinating. I would love to be able to engage the public more and spark their curiosity. You use that word. Yes, I am a very curious person, and I would like to nurture that curiosity in at least some of our visitors and let them see and just sit back and see where they go, because that's kind of what we're here for, is to nurture that inspire curiosity.
Yeah, very cool.
Final question I had for you, because I just got to ask it. Do you have a favorite dinosaur movie, book, TV show, other associated media product? I mean, you're out there doing the work, and I'm sure you see a lot of discrepancies with what popular media does with dinosaurs. But what's your favorite, if you have one?
Great question. As a kid, Disney had a movie called Fantasia.
Right.
And there's a sequence in there at the end of the dinosaurs. And I was young enough that it probably made me bawl. I was so upset. So I'm not sure that's my favorite. But
it stuck with you.
It stuck with me for sure. Mm-hmm. And of course, Jurassic Park is the original one, is something that stands with most of us. And if the younger generation, it's impressive to me how many paleontologists of a certain age cohort were inspired by that movie. But my favorite memory of that movie has less to do with the movie and more to do with, I was on the Berkeley campus and the person next to me, in fact, named the dinosaur that spit poison in that movie. And he was about 900 years old. And I cherished every morning I'd hear him shuffle down the hallway. He'd stop in my office and talk to me for 15 minutes. And, as a young person, he would regale me with tales of old. And one morning, he shuffled very quickly and it's like, ooh, what's got Sam up in arms? And he had just seen Jurassic Park, and he was absolutely livid over what Steven Spielberg had done to his dinosaur. And he went through the whole list of things that were wrong. And Sam was very agitated. And like I said, he was like 900 years old. That literally my hand went to the phone because I thought, oh my God, Steven Spielberg killed one of the giants of my profession in my office. I needed to dial 911.
He was that upset.
He was very upset, but then he finally shrugged his shoulders and said, well, it was a good monster movie, and then shuffled off to his office. So to answer your question, probably Jurassic Park.
Yeah, it's a great one. We were just talking about it the other day because I just feel like, the remakes and the animatronics and the construction of those dinosaurs were something to marvel at to this day. I just recently showed that movie, the original, to my 7-year-old, and it's so cool experiencing that and watching her marvel at these like T-Rexes and the reality of like, oh my gosh, these were massive creatures. So it's very cool. Yeah, love that. Dr. Anthony Fiorillo, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your time.
Again, a special thanks to Dr. Anthony Fiorillo for joining us here today and sharing his passion with us. I think that probably really came through in that interview, was just how nearly 3 decades of work have really challenged many of the assumptions that they used to have about that era of dinosaurs in this field.
Yeah, I love how he said, if resurrection works, he would do it all over again. That's so cool to talk to somebody who really loves and enjoys the work that they do. Absolutely. And is doing the work right alongside some of the students that he used to teach, which is just really, really cool. Yeah. Alaska's on my bucket list. Have you been there? I
have not. Yeah, I mean, I can say I've watched one of those YouTube channels with a lot of those Alaska expeditions out there, and it is an incredible place that seems very challenging for so many people, and I can only imagine that challenge is what fuels many of them to live out there.
Beautiful place. Well, thank you all for listening. If you've got story ideas or people you'd like to hear from on our show, always feel free and reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email, and gburknm on social media.
I'm Chris.McKee at krqe.com, also at Chris McKee TV. Thanks for watching and listening.